The planet of Velaris had stopped hoping 3 days ago. The cities were burning, the defense towers were silent, and the enemy ships covered the sky like dark clouds before a storm. Every person on the planet knew the truth. The war was over. There would be no rescue, no miracle, and no tomorrow. The only thing left was to choose how to face the end. Commander Relin stood on the walls of Fort 7 and watched the enemy army move across the valley below. Thousands of armored soldiers marched forward without fear. Behind them rolled giant machines that could break mountains and destroy cities in minutes. The soldiers inside the fort had only enough energy cells for one final battle. After that, they would have nothing left to fight with. Inside the command room, the officers waited in silence. No one argued anymore. No one searched for new plans. Every possible escape route had already been destroyed by the enemy fleet in orbit. The communication systems were dead, and every nearby colony had already fallen. Velaris was alone in the darkness of space. Relin looked at the tired faces around him. Some soldiers cleaned their rifles for the last time. Others sat quietly and stared at pictures of their families. A young officer finally broke the silence and asked the question everyone feared. "Commander, how much time do we have left?" Relin looked at the battlefield display before answering. "Less than 2 hours." The room became quiet again. Outside, warning sirens echoed across the fort as enemy artillery began striking the outer walls. Dust fell from the ceiling with every explosion. The ground itself seemed to shake in fear. Still, no one ran. No one begged. The defenders of Velaris had already accepted their fate. Far below the fort, civilians gathered inside underground shelters. Parents held their children close while emergency lights flickered above them. Some people prayed while others simply waited in silence. The oldest among them had lived through many wars, but none had ever seen destruction like this. Everyone believed these were the final hours of their world. Commander Relin walked onto the highest platform of the fort and looked toward the sky. Enemy warships filled the atmosphere from horizon to horizon. Their weapons glowed with terrible power. One command from the enemy flagship would erase Fort 7 from existence. Relin closed his eyes for a moment and prepared himself for the order he never wanted to give. "All units," he said through the communication system. "This is Commander Relin speaking. We hold this position until the end. There will be no retreat and no surrender." His voice remained calm even as explosions thundered around him. Across the fort, soldiers straightened their backs and prepared for their final stand. Then something strange happened. One of the radar officers suddenly shouted from inside the control room, "Commander, we have new objects entering the atmosphere." Relin turned immediately. New objects appeared on the display screen, moving faster than anything they had seen before. There were dozens of them, then hundreds. Their speed was unbelievable. Relin's face became serious. "Enemy missiles?" he asked. The radar officer shook his head. "No, Commander. They are too large to be missiles and too small to be ships." Another officer stepped closer to the screen and stared at the strange signals. "They are falling directly toward the battlefield." Outside, soldiers looked up as bright lights appeared high above the clouds. Long trails of fire crossed the sky like burning stars. More lights followed behind them. Soon the entire sky was filled with them. For a moment, the battlefield became silent as both armies stopped and watched the strange event above them. The enemy commander noticed them too. Their ships moved into defensive positions, and weapon systems began tracking the falling objects. Whatever was coming, even the enemy did not expect it. The soldiers of Velaris exchanged nervous looks. Some believed it was a new enemy weapon meant to end the battle quickly. The objects grew larger as they descended through the atmosphere. Their metal surfaces reflected the fire of the burning cities below. Shock waves rolled across the sky as they broke through the clouds. One soldier whispered, "I've never seen technology like this before." Commander Relin stared at the falling objects and felt something he had not felt in many days. Hope. Then the first object struck the ground behind enemy lines with the force of a small earthquake. Another landed beside it. Then another. Within seconds, hundreds of metal pods crashed across the battlefield. The battlefield became silent. A loud mechanical sound echoed across the valley, The doors of the first pod slowly began to open. The metal doors of the first pod opened slowly. Thick smoke poured out and covered the ground around it. Every soldier on both sides watched without moving. Commander Relin held his rifle tightly as a tall figure stepped out of the pod. The stranger wore black armor with a dark visor covering his face. A strange symbol was painted on his chest plate. It was the symbol of Earth. More pods opened across the battlefield. Hundreds of armored soldiers walked out with perfect discipline and calm movements. They carried weapons unlike anything the defenders of Velaris had ever seen. Their armor looked heavy, but they moved as if it weighed nothing. The enemy army remained frozen for several seconds. No one understood who these newcomers were. One enemy commander finally gave the order to fire. Energy blasts filled the air and raced toward the newly arrived soldiers. The humans did not run for cover. Instead, they raised glowing shields and continued moving forward. The blasts exploded against the shields without slowing them down. For the first time in the entire war, the enemy attack had failed. The leader of the human force stepped forward and activated his communicator. His deep voice echoed across the battlefield and through every radio channel on the planet. "This is Colonel Marcus Kane of the United Earth Marine Corps." The battlefield became completely silent. "To the people of Velaris, stand your ground. Humanity has entered the fight." The words spread through the city within minutes. Soldiers repeated them to each other in disbelief. Civilians in underground shelters listened to the message with tears in their eyes. Parents hugged their children tighter than before. Some people thought it was a dream or a trick by the enemy. Others simply looked toward the sky and prayed that it was real. Commander Relin stared at the human soldiers below. He had heard stories about humanity before. The galaxy spoke of humans as explorers, traders, and builders. But there were also darker stories. Stories about human soldiers who never stopped advancing. Stories about battles that humans refused to lose. Relin had never believed those stories until now. Without warning, the human Marines charged forward. Their movement was fast and organized. Small drones flew above them and marked enemy positions with red lights. Seconds later, human rifles opened fire with incredible accuracy. Enemy vehicles exploded one after another across the battlefield. The advance that had taken weeks to build began to collapse in minutes. The enemy commanders quickly ordered reinforcements into the battle. Heavy tanks rolled forward while aircraft screamed through the sky above them. The Marines showed no fear. Some fired rockets that destroyed tanks with single shots. Others moved through enemy lines with unbelievable speed and precision. Every action looked practiced thousands of times before. Commander Relin watched the battle from the fort walls in complete shock. His officers stood beside him without speaking. They had fought this enemy for almost a year and had never pushed them back even once. Yet the humans had arrived less than 20 minutes ago and were already changing the entire battlefield. It felt impossible to believe. Then the ground suddenly shook beneath everyone's feet. A massive enemy walker appeared from behind the mountains in the distance. It stood taller than the fort walls and carried weapons powerful enough to destroy cities. The defenders of Velaris knew this machine well. Entire armies had fallen trying to stop even one of them. Fear returned to the soldiers' faces. The giant machine fired its main weapon toward the human lines. A huge explosion covered the battlefield with fire and smoke. For several seconds, nobody could see anything through the dust. Commander Relin lowered his head sadly. He feared the human rescue had ended before it truly began. The enemy soldiers began cheering loudly. Then the smoke started to clear. The giant walker was still standing, but something was different. A single human Marine stood directly in front of it. His armor was damaged and covered in dust, but he had not moved an inch. In his hands was a weapon larger than any rifle Relin had ever seen. The Marine slowly aimed it toward the machine. One shot echoed across the valley. The beam of light struck the walker directly in its center. For a second, nothing happened. Then cracks of energy spread across the machine's armor from top to bottom. The giant walker exploded with enough force to shake the mountains around it. Silence fell over the battlefield once again. The enemy soldiers stopped moving. The human Marine lowered his weapon and calmly spoke into his communicator. "Target destroyed. Continue the advance." Commander Relin looked at the battlefield and finally understood something important. The humans had not come to save Velaris. They had come to win the war. The destruction of the giant walker changed everything. Enemy soldiers who had marched forward with confidence now stopped in confusion. Their commanders shouted new orders across communication channels, but fear had already entered their ranks. Across the battlefield, human Marines continued advancing without slowing down. Their movements were calm and precise, as if this battle had already been won before it began. Commander Relin watched the battlefield through his command screen. Enemy lines that had held strong for months were collapsing within minutes. Human drones flew over the battlefield, marking targets with bright lights. Seconds later, accurate strikes destroyed supply vehicles and artillery positions. The enemy army was losing its coordination faster than anyone thought possible. For the first time in many months, the soldiers of Velaris left the safety of their walls. Inspired by the humans, they joined the counterattack beside them. Relin himself led the first group out of Fort 7. His soldiers still felt fear, but something stronger had replaced their hopelessness. They finally believed that survival was possible. As the defenders moved across the battlefield, they saw something surprising. Human Marines stopped to protect wounded Velaryon soldiers. Others carried injured civilians toward safe zones behind the front lines. One Marine even gave his medical supplies to an alien child hiding near a destroyed building. The humans had not come only to fight. They had come to protect. Relin approached Colonel Marcus Kane near the center of the battlefield. The human commander stood calmly while battle reports appeared on his helmet display. Relin looked at him with disbelief and asked the question everyone wanted answered. Why did humanity come here? Marcus looked toward the burning horizon before giving a simple answer. Because someone asked for help. Relin remained silent for several seconds. The galaxy was filled with powerful empires and wealthy governments. Many had ignored Velaris when the invasion began. Some had promised support but never arrived. Yet humanity, a species located far from this sector, had crossed the stars to defend strangers they had never met before. Before Relin could speak again, warning alarms suddenly echoed across every communication channel. Human officers immediately looked toward the sky. Above the clouds, a massive shadow slowly appeared in orbit. It was larger than any ship Relin had ever seen. The enemy flagship had finally arrived. The giant vessel blocked the sunlight as it moved into position above the planet. Its weapons glowed with enough power to destroy entire continents. The enemy army below immediately stopped retreating and began cheering once again. Their confidence returned as they looked toward their greatest weapon. The battle was far from over. Colonel Marcus studied the ship quietly through his helmet display. One of his officers stepped beside him and spoke in a serious voice. Sir, orbital scans confirm it. The flagship carries planet cracker weapons. Several Velaryon officers looked at each other in horror. They knew exactly what that meant. If the flagship fired those weapons, Velaris would die. Commander Relin lowered his head in defeat. Even the humans could not stop a ship like that. Ground victories meant nothing against a weapon capable of destroying a world from orbit. Around him, the soldiers of Velaris slowly lost hope once again. The nightmare they thought was ending had returned. Then Colonel Marcus activated his communicator. All Marine units, he said calmly. Phase 2 begins now. Relin looked at him in confusion. The human commander showed no fear, no panic, and no hesitation. Instead, he looked toward the sky as if he had expected this moment from the beginning. Around the battlefield, human soldiers began moving toward new positions with perfect discipline. Suddenly, dozens of new signals appeared on the radar screens. Then hundreds. Commander Relin stared at the display in disbelief as massive ships exited hyperspace above Velaris. Their metal hulls reflected the light of the distant stars. One after another, they formed a defensive wall between the enemy flagship and the planet below. A shocked officer whispered the words everyone was thinking. That was only the first wave. Colonel Marcus looked up at the growing human fleet and spoke quietly. Now the real battle begins. The arrival of the human fleet changed the sky above Velaris. Massive warships moved into position between the planet and the enemy flagship. Their engines lit up the darkness of space like small stars. Across the battlefield below, soldiers stopped fighting for a moment and looked upward. Everyone knew that the next battle would decide the fate of the planet. Inside the command center of the enemy flagship, alarms began to sound. The enemy commanders had expected a rescue force, but not an entire fleet. They quickly ordered their ships into attack formations. Hundreds of fighters launched from the flagship and rushed toward the human vessels. Within seconds, space above Velaris became a battlefield of fire and light. Commander Rellin watched the battle through orbital displays inside Fort 7. Human ships moved with incredible speed and coordination. Enemy fighters disappeared in flashes of light as human defense systems opened fire. Explosions covered the darkness of space like fireworks during a festival. For the first time, the enemy fleet was being pushed back, but the enemy flagship remained untouched. The giant vessel slowly turned toward the planet below. Its main weapon began gathering energy for a firing sequence. Red warning lights flashed across every military station on Velaris. Scientists calculated the impact within seconds. If the weapon fired, entire continents would disappear beneath oceans of fire. Colonel Marcus Kane looked at the display without showing fear. He turned toward his officers and gave a single order. "Prepare the boarding team." The room became silent for a moment. Every Marine understood the mission immediately. They would not destroy the flagship from outside. They would enter it and destroy it from within. Within minutes, several human assault ships left the fleet and raced toward the enemy vessel. Enemy guns opened fire from every direction. Explosions surrounded the small ships as they crossed the battlefield in space. Several were damaged during the approach, but none changed course. The Marines continued moving forward. Commander Rellin watched in disbelief. "They are flying directly into enemy fire," he said quietly. One human officer standing nearby nodded calmly. "That is what Marines do," he replied. "If there is no safe path forward, they make one." Rellin looked back toward the screen, unable to speak. The assault ships finally reached the flagship's outer hull. Explosive charges blasted open entry points through thick armor plating. Human Marines rushed inside before enemy forces could react. Fighting broke out across corridors, control rooms, and engine chambers. Every hallway became a battlefield as the Marines pushed deeper into the ship. Colonel Marcus led the attack personally. His squad moved toward the flagship's reactor core while enemy soldiers attacked from every direction. The fighting became harder with every level they crossed. Ammunition supplies grew lower, and casualties slowly increased. Still, the Marines never stopped advancing. Back on Velaris, the giant weapon above the planet continued charging. Scientists estimated less than 10 minutes remained before firing. Across the cities and shelters, civilians looked toward the sky with fear in their eyes. The battle on the flagship had become the final hope for their world. If the Marines failed, everything would end. Then a message arrived from Colonel Marcus. Reactor chamber reached. Beginning final operation. Commander Rellin felt hope return once again. Around him, soldiers and civilians listened carefully to every update from the human team. Minutes passed like hours as the battle inside the flagship continued. Then suddenly all communication stopped. The room became silent. Seconds later, a massive explosion erupted deep inside the enemy flagship. Cracks of light spread across its enormous hull from one side to the other. The giant vessel began to break apart as fire burst from its engines and weapon systems. The planet cracker weapon shut down only moments before firing. Cheers erupted across Velaris, but Commander Rellin did not celebrate. He looked at the communication screen and noticed something terrible. There were no signals coming from Colonel Marcus or his Marines. The flagship was destroyed, but the heroes who saved the planet had vanished with it. The destruction of the enemy flagship marked the end of the battle for Velaris. Across the planet, people left their shelters and looked toward the sky in disbelief. The enemy fleet was retreating in every direction. Cities that had expected destruction now saw the light of a new morning. For the first time in many months, the people of Velaris were free, but Commander Rellin could not celebrate with the others. His thoughts remained on the human Marines who had disappeared aboard the flagship. Rescue ships searched the wreckage field in orbit for hours. Every damaged section of the destroyed vessel was scanned carefully. Yet no signs of Colonel Marcus Kane or his team could be found. As the search continued, a signal suddenly appeared on human communication channels. It was weak and broken, but it was real. Every officer inside Fort 7 immediately turned toward the display screens. The room became completely silent as the message repeated itself again and again. It was a marine emergency beacon. Human rescue ships changed direction immediately. Minutes later, they discovered a damaged assault shuttle hidden among the wreckage of the flagship. The shuttle had lost power and communications during the explosion. Its hull was heavily damaged, but life signs were still present inside. The missing Marines had survived. Cheers echoed across command centers, shelters, and city streets. Commander Relin himself traveled to meet the survivors as they returned to Velaris. The shuttle doors opened slowly, and the Marines stepped outside one by one. Their armor was damaged and covered with burn marks from the battle, yet they stood proudly as if nothing had happened. Colonel Marcus was the last to leave the shuttle. Raylan walked toward him and stopped for a moment before speaking. "You saved our world," he said quietly. "Why risk so much for people you had never met?" Marcus looked toward the sky above Velaris before answering. "Because nobody should face extinction alone." The words spread across the planet faster than any military report. Children repeated them in schools and families shared them in their homes. Soon they spread beyond Velaris to other worlds across the galaxy. Species that had once feared humanity began to see them differently. They finally understood what humans truly valued. Weeks later, a ceremony was held in the capital city of Velaris. Thousands gathered to honor the fallen defenders and the human Marines who had fought beside them. New monuments were built near Fort 7 overlooking the battlefield where everything had changed. Human and Valerian flags stood together in the wind. Commander Relin stood beside Colonel Marcus during the ceremony. He looked across the crowd and remembered the day they had prepared to die. He remembered the burning cities, the enemy ships, and the hopeless faces of his soldiers. Then he remembered the lights falling from the sky like stars. He smiled for the first time in many months. Across the galaxy, stories about the Battle of Velaris continued to spread. Some spoke about the bravery of the defenders. Others spoke about the great fleet that arrived from nowhere. But one story was repeated more than any other. When the people of Velaris were ready to die, human Marines descended from the sky, and the galaxy learned an important lesson. Humans do not ignore a call for help. And when human Marines enter a war, they do not come to survive, they come to win.